Okay, so now that we've looked at the pathways underlying hemostasis, let's now talk about thrombosis and the antithrombotic mechanisms which the endothelium has to try and prevent thrombosis from occurring. So, firstly, what is thrombosis? So, thrombosis is it's basically the activation of the hemostatic pathway when it shouldn't be activated. So the hemostatic pathway is supposed to be activated when you have a hole in the side of a blood vessel. Thrombosis is when you activate the hemostatic pathway within a perfectly healthy blood vessel. Okay, so let's say, well, I won't say perfectly healthy, I shouldn't say perfectly healthy because usually the blood vessel isn't perfectly healthy, but it at least doesn't have a hole in the side of it, okay? So, let me draw an atherosclerotic plaque here as well, because that's often the thing that leads to thrombosis, although there can be other causes, but we'll have an atherosclerotic plaque. So that's why I say it's not a perfectly healthy blood vessel here. So, thrombosis, I'll repeat it again because it's worth repeating, is the production of a hemostatic plug in a blood vessel that has not got a hole in the side of it. However, what causes this thrombotic event to occur? Often it is because there is some sort of pathology. So for instance, it may be because there is an atherosclerotic plaque, which remember is a inflammatory response within the tunica intima. So let's say this is our atherosclerotic plaque here. Okay, so what happens basically is that you get platelets adhering to the surface of the atherosclerotic plaque, okay? So, you'll get platelets adhering to this endothelial cells, which they should not adhere to, basically. But because of the atherosclerotic plaque, the endothelial cells are dysfunctioning, and this leads to platelets adhering to them, just like they would adhere to endothelial cells which have been cut in half, basically, by a knife coming into the arteriole. Okay, then what also happens is you get platelet activation, so they start releasing thromboxane A2, they start releasing ADP, and you set off a chain reaction. Then the thromboxane A2 causes the platelets all to become sticky, and so you'll start getting platelets aggregating together, so you'll produce what is effectively a primary platelet plug. And then even worse, what you can start to do is get coagulation activated. So again, platelet activation is activated by similar things to what activates the coagulation cascade. We've seen that in the hemostatic pathway, platelets are activated by collagen and tissue factor, and it's the same for the coagulation pathway. So what you'll also get happening over here is you'll get fibrinogen being converted to fibrin, and you'll get the assembly of fibrin strands, which will now intertwine among the platelets that are taking part in this primary platelet plug and form a meshwork which will strengthen the primary hemostatic plug. And it's very important that you understand how important the fibrin is. The platelets just aggregating together, they are held together really loosely. Their interactions are not strong. You know, it's something that could very easily be destroyed, basically, just a primary platelet aggregate. Okay, so to make it strong and make it something that's dangerous, to make it a thrombosy, what you need is you need this fibrin meshwork that's holding all the platelets together. So you do need coagulation to get a proper thrombus. Okay, and by the way, when you get this structure here now, and it should not be there, this was previously called a secondary hemostatic plug, but now when it's pathological, when it's not there to plug the hole in the side of a broken arteriole or broken blood vessel, it's known as a thrombus, and you are said to be suffering from thrombosis. Now, if this happens in a blood vessel, what's it going to lead to? It could completely occlude the lumen of the blood vessel and could stop blood from getting to whichever portion of the body this blood vessel supplies. Now, if this thrombosis, which is the process by which you form a thrombus, occurs in a blood vessel which is supplying the heart or the brain, then this can be very dangerous, because if you don't supply blood to a tissue, what's going to happen is that that tissue is going to die. And in the heart and the brain, if cells in the heart and the brain die, you can't replace them. The heart and the brain have very low levels of proliferation. The rule generally is that the cells that you have in your heart and in your brain, you have had since birth, basically. There is some division in the heart and the brain, but it's so low that it's trivial, basically. And I, for one, find that quite interesting, because these are the two most important organs of the body, and yet their ability to regenerate themselves is the most feeble, okay? Which is why damage to these two organs is so devastating. Okay, so if you get a thrombus forming in a blood vessel that supplies a portion of the heart muscle, and that occludes blood from getting to that portion of the heart muscle, then what that's going to lead to is ischemia of that portion of the blood vessel of the heart, and that can then lead to infarction. So infarction is a good word. Infarction means some tissue dying because of lack of blood supply. So when a portion of the myocardium dies because of lack of blood supply, that's called myocardial infarction. So myocardial means pertaining to the myocardium, and infarction then means death due to lack of blood supply. Okay, so what will happen is a huge number of cardiomyocytes will die because of lack of blood supply. Now, this can be fatal. This, by the way, is more commonly referred to as a heart attack. Okay, now this can be fatal then and there, but if you survive a heart attack, then what it can then propagate to is heart failure, because if you've lost a huge amount of your heart muscles, let me just draw a little picture of the heart here. So here is your right atrium, here is your left ventricle, sorry, your right ventricle, I hope. Here is your left ventricle, here is your left atrium, and here is your aorta coming out here. Okay, so if you've got a huge portion of the myocardium that has died because of a myocardial infarction, then that portion isn't going to be replaced with cardiomyocytes. I mean, your body will sort out the mess. It will get rid of the dying cardiomyocytes, and it will replace it with some beautiful scar tissue. It will replace it with connective tissue. It will bring in the fibroblasts, and they'll just make collagen galore, and you will get, something that will fill the gap, but it's not going to be capable of contraction. So you've lost a huge amount of the contractile machinery within this left ventricular wall, okay? And that's going to mean that the left ventricle is going to struggle to pump blood into the aorta. Now, when the left ventricle struggles to pump blood into the aorta, what starts to happen is you start to go into the progression towards heart failure. Okay, so how this happens is because basically, if you have the left ventricular wall struggling to pump blood out into the aorta, what you need to do is increase the strength of the left ventricular wall. So I'm just going into a little bit of a detour here, okay, but it's worth it. It's a nice story, well, it's an interesting story. Okay, so if you want to strengthen the left ventricular wall, what can you do? Well, the answer is you cannot produce more cardiomyocytes. You can't make the cardiomyocytes divide. So what you need to do is make the cardiomyocytes you've already got stronger. Okay, so what happens is all of the cardiomyocytes within the heart start to expand. They undergo hypertrophy. So if I've got a single little cardiomyocyte here, what happens is it hugely enlarges. Specifically, it gets much wider, basically. Its width increases far more than its length does. And this is what's known as concentric hypertrophy. Okay, so all of the, well, not all of them initially, but some of the cardiomyocytes within the left ventricular wall are going to be induced into undergoing concentric hypertrophy. So they're going to get bigger. Now, this helps initially. Initially, these concentrically hypertrophied cardiomyocytes are capable of contracting with a greater force, okay? So that's brilliant. The body has solved the problem. The left ventricular wall will get stronger. The problem is that it's a temporary solution. These concentrically hypertrophied cells, they initially are capable of generating more force than the unhypertrophied cardiomyocyte. But unfortunately, it's short. It's a short relief. What happens is these concentrically hypertrophied cardiomyocytes just gradually lose the will to live, and the force that they are capable of generating goes down and down and down over time, okay, until actually it gets much lower than the force that the original unhypertrophied cardiomyocyte was capable of generating. So what will happen is you'll convert some of your cardiomyocytes to concentrically hypertrophied cardiomyocytes. They will initially help the problem, so they'll initially be capable of generating more force, and therefore the left ventricle will get better temporarily. But then these concentrically hypertrophied cells will give in. And then what will happen is you will actually be in a state worse than at the beginning, because now some more of these cardiomyocytes, you've got fewer cardiomyocytes which are actually contracting anymore. So these concentrically hypertrophied cells, they're just giving in, they're not doing anything, or at least they're producing so little force that it's now trivial. So you've actually got an even weaker heart than you originally had. So what's the heart solution? Well, we must turn more of the cardiomyocytes into concentrically hypertrophied cells. It's all it can do, which buys it a temporary solution, but then it declines to a state worse than it was originally, and you just continue this vicious cycle of turning more and more of the cardiomyocytes into concentrically hypertrophied cardiomyocytes, which makes the heart weaker and weaker and weaker in the long run, until the point that the heart now is no longer capable of pumping enough blood around the body in a minute to meet the needs of the body, basically, of the peripheral tissues. So when the cardiac output, which is often abbreviated to CO, which is just the volume of blood that you pump around the body in a minute, goes so low that it's no longer delivering enough oxygen or glucose to meet the needs of the body, then you are said to have gone into cardiac failure or heart failure. Okay, so basically the heart is failing the rest of the body. So either myocardial infarction will be fatal, or if you survive it, it's just going to go into heart failure. Okay, so not nice, basically. If this happens in the brain, if you get thrombosis occurring in the brain, then it can occlude the blood supply to certain portions of the brain, and this is what's known as a cerebrovascular accident, or more commonly referred to as a stroke. Cerebrovascular accident. Okay, or CVA it's often abbreviated to, and its more pervasive name is just a stroke. Okay, so these lead to portions of the brain dying, basically, and when portions of the brain die, that leads to motor deficits in occasion. It depends which bit of the brain obviously dies, but it can lead to motor deficits, it can lead to sensory deficits, it can lead to loss of memory, it can lead to cognitive deficits, all sorts of problems. Okay, it's worth also mentioning that even if this thrombus forms somewhere else in the body, so let's say it forms in the aorta, okay, and the aorta is far too thick to be blocked by a single thrombus, so that's fine, but you know, the blood pressure in the aorta and the blood flow that you've got in the aorta is going to be quite vigorous, basically. So there's a risk that it will tear this thrombus, okay? And if it tears the thrombus, what can happen is a great chunk of the thrombus can break off, basically. So you'll get this large chunk of thrombus coming off. And when you have a bit of the thrombus broken off, this now forms what's known as an embolus. Okay, so let me just talk about what an embolus is. So an embolus is actually a far more general term. Okay, so an embolus just refers to any small particle that is running around in the blood, a macroscopic particle that you can see that is running around in the blood. So this is a particle that's free in the blood. Okay, so for instance, an embolus could be, a fat droplet or an oxygen bubble or something like that. It's anything that's moving around in the blood that's large. Okay, this is specifically what's known as a thromboembolus, because it's a piece of thrombus that has broken off and is now free in the bloodstream. And this thromboembolus could go off to other blood vessels. For instance, it could maybe go up the coronary artery. It could go up the coronary arteries and get lodged in some artery supplying the heart, or it could go up the carotid arteries up to the brain, and could lead to stroke. So there are many dangers of thrombosis. Okay, so we want to see what usually stops this thrombosis from occurring in blood vessels, basically, and it's because of mechanisms that the endothelial cells have that this doesn't occur in normal blood vessels. And we'll continue this discussion in the next video.